In 1267, the Mongol Empire gave the Russian Orthodox Church a complete tax exemption in writing, while crushing millions of Russians under tribute and terror. You were never told this in school. The Church didn't just survive the Mongol conquest, it made a deal. And the reason that deal was buried is darker than anything they taught you about the Tatar Yoke. Here's what you were taught. The Mongols swept into Russia in 1237, burned everything, killed everyone, and enslaved the Russian people for 2.5 centuries. The Tatar Yoke, pure domination, no negotiation, just submission and suffering. That part is true enough. But history is never that clean. What gets left out deliberately, consistently, across Russian historical memory for hundreds of years, is what was happening behind church walls while peasants and princes bled. The Golden Horde, the western branch of the Mongol Empire that controlled Russia, didn't run their territory through force alone. They were empire builders. And empire builders understand something. You cannot police everyone yourself. You need local proxies, institutions with existing authority, people the population already obeys. In Russia, they found exactly who they needed. His name was Mongol Temur, Khan of the Golden Horde, 1267. In that year, he issued a document to Metropolitan Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, called a yarlyk. A yarlyk was a Mongol imperial charter, a formal decree backed by the full administrative and military weight of the empire. This one said, the church, its clergy, its land, its properties, exempt from all Mongol taxation. No tribute, no dan, the crushing annual levy every other Russian paid, no conscription of priests into Mongol armies, no seizure of church estates. In exchange, the church would pray for the Khan. That was the entire deal. While ordinary Russians surrendered 1/10 of everything they owned to Mongol collectors, the church paid nothing. While Russian nobles had estates stripped and princes were summoned to the horde's capital and assassinated for political convenience, the church's landholdings were legally shielded by the conquerors themselves. The documents survived. You just weren't taught about them. And it didn't stop with Mongol Temur. Over the next century, at least 6 additional yarlyks were issued to successive metropolitans by successive khans. This wasn't a gesture. It was a formal, maintained, renewable arrangement, renewed again and again while the Russian people bled. Here's where it gets strange. The Russian nobility was being decimated, lands confiscated, populations conscripted or killed, but church landholdings were growing, fast. By the time the Mongol grip began loosening in the 14th century, the Orthodox Church was the single largest landowner in Russia. Not despite the occupation, during it. And that's not even the strangest part. Here's what doesn't add up. The standard story says the Russian Orthodox Church was the soul of Russian resistance. It preserved Russian identity under the foreign boot. It was the moral anchor that kept civilization together through 2 centuries of horror. That's not entirely wrong. But look at what actually happened. The church that supposedly resisted the Mongols was the same institution holding written protections issued by the Mongol Khan. The metropolitans who preached Russian endurance were the same men traveling to Sarai, the horde's glittering capital on the Volga, to renew their charters with the occupying power. That's not resistance, that's administration. So who was the church actually serving? Here's what they don't teach. The yarlyk wasn't charity, it was a contract. The Mongols exempted the church from taxation because the church could do something tax collectors couldn't: manage the spiritual submission of a conquered people. Keep 60 million subjects facing inward toward salvation, away from revolt. Metropolitan Peter, the most powerful church figure of the early 14th century, didn't merely maintain the arrangement, he cultivated it. He visited Sarai in person, he met with khans directly, he returned with protections renewed and extended. The relationship wasn't reluctant, it was nurtured. The reason this was buried is simple. When Moscow finally consolidated power and proclaimed the end of the Mongol yoke in the 15th century, the church's moral authority was the foundation of that new Russian identity. The entire story of Russian survival depended on the church being the noble, suffering victim, not the quiet administrative partner of the occupying power. So the yarlyks were minimized, omitted from the popular telling, tucked into academic corners where they couldn't unsettle the mythology. The partnership was real. The victim narrative was constructed afterward. Think about what that means. The Russian Orthodox Church, the institution that shaped Russian culture, blessed Russian czars, and stands today as a central pillar of Russian national identity, built its land empire during the Mongol occupation, with Mongol protection. The wealth accumulated in those 2.5 centuries funded the monasteries, the manuscripts, the golden architecture Russia still points to as civilizational heritage. And the organizational authority the church developed as a Mongol intermediary. That is exactly the model the Tsars inherited when they built the Russian Empire. Modern Russian power, the church, the autocracy, the fusion of spiritual and state authority, traces its structure directly to a deal made with the Tatar conquerors. That's not a footnote. That's a foundation. Here's what no one has cleanly answered. When Moscow's princes finally declared liberation from the horde, and the church stood beside them, celebrating, did the metropolitans know they were commemorating the end of a partnership they had quietly maintained for 2 centuries? Or was the liberation always part of the arrangement?